All right, so welcome back to the Young Idealist and my ongoing series on classical German philosophy and post-Kantian thought, continuing my series on new book releases and monographs with authors that are publishing on figures in this tradition. I have Audrey Borowski, who is a research fellow on digitalization project between University of Bonn and the University of Cambridge. Her first monograph, Leibniz in His World, The Making of a Savant, was recently published by Princeton University Press. Right now, I'm halfway through the text. It's brilliant. She was a postdoctoral research fellow at the Munich Centre for Mathematical Philosophy, and she completed her doctorate in the history of ideas at the University of Oxford. Audrey's current research and second book project focuses on the topic of data, algorithmic systems, data in its various constant recombinations, as it is constantly redeployed and fed back, and has come to produce meaning and occupy our life worlds and shape reality. Crucially, it powers ideology, further depriving us from the conditions for genuine political action. So, welcome so much, Audrey, and thank you for being here to discuss your new book.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Chris. It is my honor. It is my honor to talk.
Here's my first question. Why Leibniz? Why this figure? And why this book project?
Why Leibniz? I started working on Leibniz a while ago. In fact, a bit before the book project and the doctoral project. It all started in my master's degree, and I got a bit really interested in a problem that I felt had not really been addressed properly, the problem of the continuum and the problem of the infinite in Leibniz. Which he addressed both mathematically and metaphysically, and for which he came up with some really, really lovely, interesting, original, sophisticated, and very imaginative answers and responses. So he has an infinite level, he has a more finite epistemological level, but ultimately with Leibniz, everything is infinite, always infinite, an infinite within an infinite and an infinite. And it was a very relevant question. And for him, in his period, like many other people in his period, like Bacon and Pascal, the big question of the day was, how do we deal with this? How do we deal with this problem? And unlike Pascal, for whom the infinite inspired, great anguish, Leibniz embraces the infinite as the manifestation of the metaphysical and the beauty of God, the infinite variation of the world, and something to be celebrated and embraced and even ideally replicated. Yeah. And so I wrote my master's thesis on the concept of paradox, or continuity as paradox, and how Leibniz also, from the metaphysical and the more metaphysical infinite level, also designs these solutions and these techniques to be able to deal on an everyday level, on a everyday basis with the infinite, coming up with various methods, which we would call, heuristic methods to deal with that infinite, which can be very paradoxical, and which I found very, very amusing, and which I felt hadn't been really dealt with appropriately. For example, the idea that we can construe two parallel lines as perpendicular for the purposes of calculation or treatment, or that technically speaking, standing still is actually a form of movement. And I found that that turn of mind, that spirit in a way, that was paradoxical, but very, very inspiring and very, very cool, if I may say. Yes.
Thank you for that answer. One of the great things about this book is that it allows us to get a real deep dive into who Leibniz was, who he met, and some of the inspirations going through his life, which I found extremely fascinating. Um, I do have a video on his life and his thought, but this is a special video because not only do we get to investigate some of the ideas in your book, but we get to learn more about who Leibniz was. Maybe we can begin by talking a little more about Leibniz, who he was, what kind of person he was, um, if that's possible.
Ah, great question. Well, that's the million-dollar question behind the book project, really, because we all know Leibniz as the great genius and the great savant and the great, the great genius battling it out with Newton over who invented the calculus and who was the greater genius and so on. And some people even argue that for historical reasons, for reasons of contingency, Newton effectively won that battle because the court of Hanover, sorry, moved to England, and Leibniz, for very practical reasons, fell out of favor. Who lies behind the figure of the great genius and the great rationalist thinker? Someone who actually led a very multifarious life. We know Leibniz mainly as a philosopher and a mathematician, but in his life, he was mainly known and he mainly exercised and he mainly worked as a lawyer, as a diplomat, as a theologian, in addition to being a mathematician. And most of the major philosophical works we know him for were actually posthumously published. So, and he led a multifarious life, but he was himself a multifarious character and with quite a personality. And he was a young person trying to make a name for himself in a highly contingent world that was not only highly contingent world, but was also governed by many rules, conventions, for formalities and rigid structures of still very much absolutist rule and power. But he was determined to try and make a name of himself and in a way try and shape, I don't want to say shape the world in his own image, but try to impose a certain vision onto the world, ideally. And, this was at times successful, but oftentimes, and this is the story that is perhaps lesser well known, unsuccessful. And uh, and so I felt quite amused in rediscovering Leibniz as a very human or too human person, figure who was not afraid to exaggerate certain facts about himself, was boastful, could be a bit petty, capable of making wild claims, while at the same time being, undeniably a very brilliant individual, as we know.
I really like how you started off kind of giving us this sketch of this figure, but also bringing in some of the things that we didn't know about him, like his pettiness, but also his brilliance as well. Maybe now we can turn to his philosophy. How do you think Leibniz understood the world?
Ah, well, it's good I brought back a copy of my master's thesis out, which was called Leibniz's Concept of Continuity as Art of Paradox. Well, the thing with Leibniz is that people often don't want to study him or don't like him or stay away from him because he doesn't fit in neat categories, and he's a philosopher who falls a bit in between, and he shaped his philosophy in that way, between organism and vitalism, for example. And for him, he's often construed as a very rationalist thinker, the thinker that is known for the binary, for the calculating machine, for the principle of sufficient reason. But actually, Leibniz has a very fluid understanding of the world, a very dynamic understanding of the world, of a world of infinity which unfolds within infinity, and so on. And that is all completely interconnected, nature never makes leaps, and in which everything is always in a state of becoming into something else. according to what Yvon Belaval terms the concept homogeny. And so he believes, as mentioned, he believes in celebration of the infinite and what I call this harmonic variation. The universe is harmoniously organized according to a supremely calculating God who is the arch mathematician, but in a beautifully unfolding organic manner, according to the principle of sufficient reason. So everything is always connected, and radical difference exists within essential similarity. And so I thought that that was really beautiful. And he develops especially, he formulates especially a particular kind of organism in his view of the world, and that goes beyond, that is compatible and in keeping with mechanical understanding of the world, but is not vitalism, but is in between, basically. And obviously, which is perhaps best known in the figure of the monad, that little atom-like creature which is closed, but which reflects the whole world, which contains and reflects the whole world from its own perspective, within itself, past, present, and future. Like if one were on top in the middle of a city and we're looking out, we would be seeing the same city, but it would be from a particular perspective. And really incredible. So, Leibniz is someone who celebrates all the expression of variety and the multiplication of expression within the infinite, basically. He found that very inspiring and hoped that humans at their level could reproduce, could emulate and replicate to a certain extent that particular vision of the world that had been created by God. Yes. I mean, Leibniz is often ridiculed for, as he famously was by Voltaire and Candide, as being Dr. Pangloss and being somewhat naively telling us that this is the best of all possible worlds before the most horrific disasters and so on. But I think that's quite unfair, and his understanding of things was much more sophisticated than that, and and quite inspiring and enchanting. And there's a sense of wonder in Leibniz, which is good to cultivate in life, I like to think.
When when people think of philosophers and they think of these great tomes, these great treatises that they write, they think of uh, people at nighttime, candlelight, feather in hand with ink writing. And what I learned a lot from your text is many of these great works by Leibniz weren't works. They were responses to letters. So the monad, uh, his treatise on the monad, right? So, which I find fascinating. So many of these short treatises were responses. He's getting all these letters from these wonderful people asking him questions and responding. So perhaps we can shift a little bit to the period. How is what is the time that he's living in? How is it a turning point in this period of ideas and philosophy and even mathematics too, if you like?
Well, I think even in general, and this is a crucial element here. And the impulse, one of the big thrusts behind this book, is relocating Leibniz in his historical world, whether it's philosophical, mathematical, diplomatic, legal, and cultural, especially. I mean, Leibniz is born right at the end of the 30 Years' War, which has wrought incredible destruction throughout Europe. And one of the big impulses for him and concerns, preoccupations throughout his life for him will be, how do I make sure this never happens again? How do I make sure that, we achieve a form of religious, theological reconciliation? And he will be working tirelessly towards that throughout his life. He's still living in a world of absolutist government. France, the France of Louis XIV, the Sun King, is really coming to the fore threateningly in some cases. And this is where Leibniz actually tries to offer his diplomatic services in order to try and convince the King of France to invade Egypt instead of the Netherlands. This obviously does not occur, but it's a good illustration of Leibniz's sense of purpose and sense of himself in the scheme of things, and the kind of schemes he came up with in an attempt to basically try and tame a bit this more contingent world in which you feel, the hand of fortune over you very, very often. It's also a world, which has been impoverished. It is a world that has been impoverished because of the 30 Years' War. It is a world, however, too, which is, starting to rise up again. And that implies need for money, need for funds, especially at a time of technical revolutions, the multiplication of technical revolutions, technico-scientific revolutions, emergence of what we was known back then as natural philosophy, and how to be able to harness those various discoveries and inventions in order to render them productive for the state primarily, and to enable the state to be even more, to grow even more powerful. And this is where, in this context, people like Leibniz, but not just Leibniz, but many people like Leibniz, are perceived as the state and are valued by the state to the extent that they can contribute to this goal. And Leibniz will precisely try to use that channel, take advantage of that channel to ingratiate himself with various rulers and try and even gain access to the Académie des Sciences. Yes, something which he did not succeed in doing. Yeah.
Well, thank you for that lovely, rich answer. One of the things that most people don't realize when they think of like the German philosopher Leibniz is that this philosopher, who you'd think would maybe write in Latin or German or his the native vernacular of the area he was born in, writes in French. And one of the great experiences that he has is going to Paris. And you spend some time on this. So what was this experience for Leibniz of going to Paris, and who are some of the people that he meets? This seems like a very impactful part of the book.
Well, I mean, it's possibly the best time that he had, one of the best times he had in his life, so happily and perhaps sadly too. And you're absolutely right in pointing out the role of letters. We tend to think of Leibniz as someone who has written these great treatises, the Theodicy, the Monadology, the Discourse on Metaphysics. But actually, in his lifetime, Leibniz was a prolific letter writer, and that's what he was doing, and that's what he was mainly known for, passing on news, collecting information. He becomes a real networker even very early in his life, and he sends out a lot of information himself. And, hoping that this will bring him, position him in some kind of leading role at the Republic of Letter level, but also potentially at the more senior, the more governmental, quote unquote, level. And, this comes particularly to the fore when he's in Paris and where he has a wonderful time, because Paris at the time is really where all the action is taking place. This is where you've got Louis XIV, who has established a new academy, which is where any young scholar with certain ambitions, scientific, technical, and even greater, wants to be. And so Leibniz manages, under rather dubious pretexts, actually, to get sent to Paris on this mission to help to prevent France from invading the Netherlands. But he takes full advantage of that period and of that stay meeting a huge number of people, from mathematicians, diplomats, philosophers, geographers, historians, theologians. I mean, every possible person he can meet, really. And part of my work was trying to reconstruct exactly, to a certain extent, what he had been doing in Paris and the work that he had been undertaking there.
When he finally returns to Germany, or when he finally returns, um, maybe as a librarian, or I think there seems to be a shift between projects and a shift between his role between Paris and Germany. So what is this shift and maybe his role and ideas, his life between Paris and Germany?
Well, he tries, I mean, Paris is going to act as a catalyst for him in many respects, and it's going to act as the trigger, the impulse for trying to put into practice a lot of the more theoretical, abstract ideas that he had observed, collected, or come up with in Paris and before. Also, there's a big change of scenery. Paris is a huge court. I mean, it is the main stage in Europe at the time, political, scientific, and commercial. And he finds himself in a bit of a slightly more backwater in Hanover with a new employer who is somewhat amenable to his ideas of reform and interested in science like him. And so Leibniz in Hanover is going to try and start to implement some of his schemes, including concerning pertaining to mining or universal language. But he's also going to act as a commercial and technical advisor, a gatekeeper to the ruler of the time, Duke Johann Friedrich, and assessing, sifting through the various proposals that are submitted to the prince, casting others perhaps in a light that he possibly would not have been willing to be cast himself in other circumstances at other times. So there are quite a few double standards to be admired there. Because Leibniz obviously himself has many schemes and many ideas, and is himself quote unquote a projector. But obviously he is a truthful and righteous projector, and he is sincere. But the other wicked projectors, are probably only charlatans. So rulers should only listen to him and his ideas.
You brought up a key word there, projector. What is
Yeah,
a projector, right? So Leibniz as projector, his relationship to projectors, and what is a projector. So maybe we can go over the term what is a projector,
of course,
Leibniz
of
as a
course.
projector, and his relationship to other projectors, which you sort of hinted at previously, but now we're going to go into more depth.
Well, a projector and the term, so I'm using the term slightly anachronistically here because the term actually only comes into being per se in the early 18th century, but the concept antedates the term. A projector is someone who's an expert or who has particularly knowledge of a certain field or a certain object and typically goes to a patron, typically a ruler, promising that this invention is going to be beneficial to the state, especially its finances. This is a simple definition of the projector. Now, we mustn't forget that these are highly contingent times. There is often war, famine, people are very much at the mercy of contingency in this time. So very oftentimes these schemes were successful, but very oftentimes they weren't. And that's why the term projector, the concept of the projector, has become tainted and often used pejoratively. Um, but you never knew. Projectors were inventors, and as Leibniz said in himself, in his capacity as a gatekeeper, sometimes even in lots of manure, you could possibly find a diamond. But, there were also projectors could also be unreliable, fickle, or even liars, people who just promised a lot in the hope in exchange for a financial gain. So there is a distinct ambivalence attached to the term. Leibniz himself obviously presented someone as a very candid inventor, someone who was only interested in the advances and flourishing of the state and the magnificence of his various patrons. And he contrasted himself to those more dishonest and unreliable and unsuccessful projectors when he was talking about himself as a projector. As a gatekeeper, he exercised his gatekeeping capacity in trying to sift what could be potentially useful and what was going to be successful. But generally, in his case, for example, he he would make promises very often without providing proof of his claims, proofs that he expected in other projectors.
Well, thank you for clarifying that term and for giving us a very detailed answer. In terms of his projects, can you, I mean, he was a mathematician, he's a philosopher, maybe inventor, we could say. Could you tell us perhaps, or maybe sketch out some of his projects that he was involved in for societies?
Well, one of the most famous ones possibly is his project for a universal language, which might be known by you and by several members of the audience. The idea that we can come up with a universal language which will not only facilitate universal communication, but will enable us to reason perfectly and and perfectly rationally in such a manner that there would be no more disputes and thus no more arguments, no more conflicts. And because we would always agree, because we would always all reason perfectly rationally. And so he has this idea, and he's building on some of his predecessors for this, but he possibly promoted it the most. Another one, I quite personally like his visions for society, his projects for societies, and these are perhaps lesser well known. He has all of these schemes in political economy, basically in redesigning society itself, especially in his younger years, where he suggests that we redesign society, that we realign salaries, that there should be public education, that everyone should get a job in society, be no more imports, and that many different schemes. Another one that's quite cool, I like to think, is where philosophers and experts would gradually take over power effectively, take over the government gradually, the state gradually, and then set up some kind of rational governance. And I think this is the enduring theme and the red thread behind much of his thinking, especially when it comes to power and the state, is the idea of that ideal of the perfect marriage between power and wisdom, science, technology, and governance. And that the ideal state will be the one who will be ruled by effectively philosopher kings for the collective benefit, for science, for technology, because all of these are effectively forms of worship of God and perfectly rational forms of governance. Now, effectively, practically speaking, like many of Leibniz's schemes, actually, Leibniz did not always work out well in full detail his beautifully designed rationalistic projects, number one. Number two, also, he often implied that, some form of coercion would be acceptable or oppression would be acceptable for these projects to be implemented, sadly. And that's also, yes, yeah, that's also not so well known. And and he felt that once some peoples were converted, they probably would be grateful that they had been converted and that kind of thinking. Yes. So there is a bit, there is some ambiguity in Leibniz and the way he thinks. And what are we ready to accept in order to implement a perfectly rationalistic society? And some of these questions, frankly, are very similar, are not completely dissimilar to certain same questions we could ask ourselves today. What are the costs of purely rationalistic societies?
Are you referring to where he tried to be a mediator between the Catholic faith and the Protestants? He's tried to kind of reunite both the faiths. Do you mean he was trying to maybe convert everyone to one universal Christian faith? Is that what you're hinting at?
Well, for him, I mean, he ascribes to a particular kind of rationalistic faith anyway.
Yeah.
So, and I mean, there's that, but there's the idea that, we'll of setting up Janissary armies, of, taking lots of young men and training them and to wage war effectively. Um, so, despite the his public in spite of his public Irenicism, certain of his schemes inevitably entail some form of coercion or oppression or violence, and this is very often glossed over and not detailed. But that's one part. Another part, and something I wanted my readers to rediscover, is his project called Funny Thought, where he envisages effectively, the ideal city. I mean, he talks about Paris in that particular instance because he was in Paris when he wrote that particular piece, and it was inspired because he had seen a man walk on the Seine. And I'm thinking here of the opening sequence of the Olympics with the horse galloping on the Seine, which I really felt was quite similar to that and to that spirit. The idea that you would have a city devoted to the performance of science and technique and things wonderful, and and that ideally would be backed by the state effectively. So it shows many different things, including the fact that, how Leibniz sees society and governance, one that actively promotes and finances the representation of the educational and the scientific, and for the public good, and and hoping that this kind of city would be multiplied. But at the same time, many of these cities, they would serve dual purposes. They would be fun and they would be educational and wonderful, but at the same time, they would also be disciplinary. They can be seen as disciplinary too, which is very funny because, once again, this is something that we observe in our own societies, where those things that enchant us and keep us in thrall actually are also, keeping tabs on us and potentially disciplining us. So, yes. But I thought it was worthwhile that people got to rediscover that too, and the sense of marvel that Leibniz can confer to others.
The most important element of your book is Leibniz's, and this is why I think it's a fantastic text and why it should be read, by the way, is that there is this tension, this fundamental importance as of Leibniz as this corresponder, the correspondence of his, between intellectuals and scientists and natural philosophers, and there's this medium between all of them. And this seems like maybe one of the main points that you're trying to um, give to the reader or express to the reader.
No, absolutely. The correspondence is absolutely huge. And actually, I based myself mainly on that to write this book. And he had a whole network in France, but also, I mean, really throughout Europe, and later, as we see, throughout the world, communicating with Jesuits in China, collecting. Leibniz is a collector of information, and which actually was very helpful. But in that period in time is ambiguous too from a state level because you're collecting information all the time. And so you might be seen as a spy or as something of, as someone who can be problematic, for in various respects. And that's one of the reasons why I think actually Colbert never allows him to get too close. They use him for all of the information that he can provide and willingly provide in the hope that he will be let in, basically. Like Kafka in the castle, he has to stay outside. And but yes, the way he manages to position himself, and he's quite good at that, and that is definitely something he's very successful at. And, this enables these networks are what make him hugely valuable at the same time.
Well, I want to thank you so much for coming here and discussing your wonderful book with us. Leibniz in His World, The Making of a Savant, published by Princeton University Press, is out right now. I highly suggest it. It's a wonderful text.